marks the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, the signing of a bill that is one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in our nation's history. For almost 50 years, the Voting Rights Act stood as a great guardian of Americans' right to vote, the right to make their voices heard, the direction of their government, and the shape of their future. Yet 2 years ago, the Supreme Court decided to dismantle some of the most important protections of the Voting Rights Act. And in the 2 years since, despite long-standing bipartisan legacy of the Voting Rights Act, the Republican Congress has refused to allow a renewed and strengthened Voting Rights Act to come to the floor. I call upon the Speaker and the Republican majority to bring a voting rights bill to the floor now and to support the approach of Mr. Clyburn, Mr. Butterfield, and the members of Mr. Lewis, Ms. Sewell, and the members of the Congressional Black Caucus and other civil rights advocates in the Congress. Voting rights now. I'm pleased to yield to our distinguished Assistant Leader, Mr. Clyburn.
Thank you very much, Madam Leader. As Leader indicated, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of a lot of things this year. The Great Society programs put in place back in 1965, starting with the Elementary Secondary Education Act and going all the way down through November, October, November, when we passed, for the first time, outlawed quotas for immigration and also the Higher Education Act. But sandwiched in between those two great acts was the Voting Rights Act that was signed into law on August 6, 1965. We have been experiencing in recent weeks some catastrophic events tied to the celebration of the Confederate battle flag on the day that the state of South Carolina took the flag, voted to, the law was signed to take the flag off of the grounds of the State House. We had an amendment introduced here in this body to glorify the Confederate battle flag on federal properties. 3 amendments put up by Democrats to confine the display and utilization of that emblem, which we consider to be one of defiance. Those amendments were attempted to be overturned by the Calvert Amendment. As you know, because of our reaction, the Speaker pulled the entire piece of legislation from the floor, and I have read since that the appropriations process is now been suspended until such time as we can resolve this issue. Well, I'm here to say to you that the members of the Congressional Black Caucus and the full Democratic Caucus are willing to sit down with the Speaker and work out a way for us to allow the proper display and utilization of the, well, let's say inappropriate display of the flag at certain incidences. If he would only sit down with us and work out an appropriate addressing of the amendments to the Voting Rights Act or the Voter Empowerment Act of Representative Lewis, or the bill dealing with voting rights with Congresswoman Sewell. Now, we believe that there's a proper place for all of us to honor our heritage. Nothing is more of a heritage to the African Americans than the right to vote. I'll celebrate my 75th birthday come Tuesday. I remember when my parents were not allowed to register and vote. I remember very well the day my dad came home from registering to vote and placing on the front door of our house a little slogan, "I am registered." or you. I will never forget that. And so we come today to say to the Speaker, there's nothing more important to us than an unfettered right to vote. And for those who feel some heritage and relationship to the Confederate battle flag, let us sit down, bring these two pieces of legislation to the floor, and let us have a proper presentation of both. And with that, I would like to yield to the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, G.K. Butterfield of North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Clyburn. First, let me thank Leader Pelosi for supporting us on this issue. By supporting us, you're supporting all Americans who want the right to vote. The Congressional Black Caucus is continuing its effort to lift up the importance of the right to vote for every American. We are continuing our effort to persuade the Republican majority to take up Chief Justice Roberts' invitation to this Congress to amend Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act to fix the formula. That's what the Supreme Court said. Fix the formula that determines which jurisdiction should be required to submit proposed election changes for review to determine discriminatory intent or effect. The Supreme Court did not strike down Section 5. Section 5 continues to be a constitutional enactment. We are continuing to try to persuade our colleagues to also enact other voting changes that are for the purpose of protecting the right to vote. At this moment, this pre-clearance section is on hold. It is on hold, has been on hold since June 25th, 2013, until Congress can fix it. We say to our Republican colleagues, let's fix it now. Let me just close with a personal story, and I'm glad Mr. Clyburn told his personal story because I was somewhat reluctant to tell mine, but I certainly will, and I can do it very quickly. My father was a black Bermudian. He immigrated to the United States and fought in World War I. After the war, he married my mother, a Southern African-American woman who was a descendant of a slave and her master. When Dad moved to Mom's hometown in North Carolina, he was invited to register to vote by the white establishment. He was told that it was a personal favor. 25 years later, after other African Americans slowly became registered to vote, Dad for a seat on the city council from Ward 3, a ward that was 50% black, 50% white. Well, the vote was a tie vote. And after a blindfolded girl pulled his name from a container, my dad was declared the winner of that election. That was an Obama moment, if you can believe it. In 1953, this sent shockwaves across our state. 4 years later, as the city was preparing for the municipal elections again, and while my family was on vacation, the city fathers called a council meeting and changed the election method from districts to at large, so that my dad and others had to run citywide, where blacks would have little or no influence in the outcome of the election. He was defeated. Had there been a Voting Rights Act with a strong pre-clearance section, the black community would not have gone another 20 years without representation. Following the Voting Rights Act, we now have 3 African American members serving on that board. There are jurisdictions today that are or have enacted new election laws since June 25th, 2013, and implemented them with impunity. Look at North Carolina. Mr. Bisick can tell you about Texas. We must have an effective pre-clearance section to prevent discriminatory election laws from being enacted. We call on our colleagues to act now. Thank you. At this time, I will yield to the chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Honorable Linda Sánchez.
So good afternoon. I'm Congresswoman Linda Sánchez. I'm the chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and also the daughter of Mexican immigrants. My parents love this country, which is why they immigrated here many years ago. And when they became United States citizens, they felt it was a privilege but also a responsibility to participate in elections and to vote. And even though my mother is a retired teacher, she sometimes finds it more helpful to have election materials in Spanish as well as English, especially when there are complicated ballot initiatives on the ballot in California. There are millions of Americans that need the same kind of help. These Americans contribute to their communities. They want to actively participate in our democracy. but there are many barriers to their participation. And too many today are discouraged from voting because of things like discriminatory voter ID laws, last-minute voting booth changes, or the elimination of early voting programs. In the aftermath of the Shelby County decision, it's more important than ever before that we restore voting rights for all Americans. We should be focused on reducing barriers for eligible voters to vote. Alex de Tocqueville wrote more than 180 years ago that in order for our democracy to flourish and to survive, we need citizens who were informed and who participated in our democracy. So to exclude participation by enacting barriers to the ballot box is to strike a blow at the very heart of our democracy. That's why we're here today, my colleagues and I, to demand substantive action on the Voting Rights Advancement Act to restore our fundamental rights as Americans. How ironic that we are fighting the battle over symbols and images of disenfranchisement, and we should be focused on acting on ways to include people in participation. So I urge the Republican majority and Speaker Boehner to make true the promise of our democracy and to protect the right of everyone to have their voice heard at the ballot box. Y ahora algunas palabras en español. Soy Linda Sánchez, congresista y presidente del Caucus hispano aquí en el Congreso. Soy la hija de inmigrantes y mis papás trabajaron muy duro para hacerse ciudadanos. Hoy día enfrentamos muchos obstáculos para ejercer nuestro derecho de votar. Tenemos que reducir estos obstáculos y todos tenemos que participar en nuestra democracia. Hay que proteger los derechos al voto para todos. Muchas gracias. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the chair of the Asian and Pacific Islander Caucus, my colleague from California, Representative Judy Chu.
As chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, I stand here today to tell my Republican colleagues to stop wasting time. Let us focus our energy in upholding our nation's principles of democracy. Let us begin by giving every American a voice by restoring the Voting Rights Act. For Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, voter protection is more important now than ever before. As our country's fastest growing racial group, Asian Pacific Islanders are poised to be the margin of victory in elections. But since over a third of APIs are limited English proficient and almost 70% are foreign born, we are also easy prey to restrictive voting laws. And our story, for Chinese Americans were prevented by Congress from voting for 60 long years through the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It prohibited Chinese Americans from becoming naturalized citizens so that they could not vote. And so franchised for many long years, and it wasn't until 1943 that this changed. So believe me, we know how precious is the right to vote. Our communities lost precious voter protections with the Supreme Court's Shelby decision, but this shouldn't be a sign of defeat. Rather, it should be a call to Congress to step up. We must restore the Voting Rights Act so that all Americans can vote without discrimination. And now I would like to turn the podium over to our distinguished dean, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Conyers.
Thank you. What a day to have these great leaders and organizations here. I'm so proud of them and what we've been doing. I happen to have been around in 1965. That was my first vote, and a big one that I am very, very proud of. We need Section 5, of course, more than ever after the decision that came out on Shelby County. But what I want to do as we close this deal out is to yield to the icon of the civil rights movement here in the Congress, who I met when I wasn't a congressman, and he sure wasn't a congressman. The great Representative John Lewis of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Conyers, my friend. Leader Pelosi, thank you for bringing us all together. Thank you for all you do to get each one of us to keep our eyes on the prize. If any of you have an opportunity to visit my congressional office in the Camden building, I have a photograph with President Lyndon Johnson giving me one of the pens that he used to sign the Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965. Across the country, there's a deliberate, systematic attempt to make it harder and more difficult for the disabled, students, seniors, minority, the poor, and rural voters to participate in the democratic process. We must not let that happen. That is why we need to repair and restore the Voting Rights Act now more than ever before. The burden should not be placed on citizens whose rights are violated to mount their own defense. As leaders of the Congress, we have the power to change that. We can make access to the ballot box more simple and more fair. My own mother, father, grandparents, and great-grandparents could not register to vote. They didn't become registered voters until after the Voting Rights Act was passed and signed into law on August 6, 1965. In my native state of Alabama and in so many other parts of the South, people were asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, the number of jelly beans in a jar, pay a poll tax. We have to throw off the burden of fear in the past and continue to move forward. As leaders of this country, we have a moral obligation to repair and fix the Voting Rights Act. It is our duty in a democratic society to open up the political process and let every citizen have a say in their own future. There's something every American and all of us here in the Congress can agree on. We must do it now. We must do it on our own watch. It is what the country deserves. It is what the American people deserve. It is now my great pleasure and my delight to present a daughter of Alabama, a daughter of Selma, Alabama. Where 1965, only 2.1% of black people in Selma and Dallas County were registered to vote. People stood in a movable line. Terri Sewell, Congresswoman, 50 years later. Terri Sewell.
Today I stand with my colleagues to demand that Congress act to restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We must not allow ourselves to be distracted by all this talk about a Confederate flag and symbols and statutes. To be sure, these offensive symbols are relics of the past, and that's where they belong, in the past. But to truly change the hearts and minds of people, we must do it now, have policies and laws that change behavior. So today we declare that restoring the Voting Rights Act is the tangible, substantive way that we in Congress can level the playing field and ensure that all Americans have access to the ballot box. It is a unique and positive action that only Congress can do. 2 years ago, the Supreme Court in the Shelby decision obliterated Section 4 and preclearance and federal protection for vulnerable communities. The Supreme Court issued us here in Congress a challenge. They said that they needed a modern-day formula in order to be able to have federal protection. They didn't say that federal protection wasn't needed. They said that they needed a modern-day formula. Well, Congress can and must answer that challenge. The fate of our democracy depends on its citizens having the unfettered, unrestricted right to vote. Our vote is our voice, and no voice should be silenced. We must never surrender the voice, our voice, that was died for, prayed for, marched for by brave Americans like our beloved Congressman John Lewis. When we place barriers to voting or support voting practices that have the intended or unintended consequences of impacting vulnerable communities, that's what we're doing. The hypocrisy of this Congress is really baffling to me. You know, just in March 7th, Congressman Lewis welcomed, and I welcomed to Selma, over 100 members of Congress to commemorate, really celebrate, what happened on Bloody Sunday. The fact that brave men and women, ordinary Americans, could collectively working together achieve extraordinary social change was something that both Republicans and Democrats showed up in Selma to do. It was a kumbaya moment. But when we came back to Congress, what did we do? Nothing. Yes, we agreed to give a congressional gold medal to the foot soldiers, and it is long time coming. But instead of giving a medal, my challenge to my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, is that we actually restore the Voting Rights Act. I, along with Senator Leahy and Congresswoman Sánchez and Chu, dropped a bill on June 25th of this year, the second anniversary of the Shelby decision. It was called the Voting Rights Advancement Act. And it is an expansive bill that not only restores preclearance, but has a modern-day formula. The look back is since 1990 and going forward. And I have you know that 13 states were captured by this new formula. States like Alabama, but also states like California and New York. This act is what we want people to act on now. It's expansive. It includes Native Americans and Alaskan Americans as well. It includes making sure that the ballots are done in multiple languages so that all Americans have a right to vote. And it also calls out known practices like moving from districts that are defined to at-large districts that often dilute the vote for African Americans and vulnerable communities. In closing, I think that we in Congress are the only ones who can truly act on what the challenge was from the Shelby case. My hope is that we act now, that we take the opportunity when this country is mourning the loss of 9 Americans due to hatred. We can level the playing field and bring back and restore the Voting Rights Act. We must do so. We have to do so, and we should do it now.
Thank you. Thank you. Well done.
Great job.
The photograph that you see here is a manifestation of the challenge people have. The beautiful part of it is people want to vote. They consider it a blessing, a privilege, a responsibility. But with closing of polling places and reducing the number of hours that the polling places that are open, and also by reducing the number of voting machines and just eliminating access to the ballot, we are, how can it be, what our founders think, erecting obstacles to participation rather than removing them. Since June of 2 years ago, 2013, this Congressional Black Caucus, Hispanic Caucus, Asian Pacific Caucus, all of us have been trying to get a bill brought to the floor. It's a compromise. We can do better, and the Sewell bill is better. We can do more, and the Lewis bill is more. But there has been an opportunity for the Republican majority not just to send a condolence card or show up at a service, but to translate that into action. And we are now segueing from the conversation about the flag to a conversation about voting rights now. Any questions from my colleagues? Any other comments any of you would like to make on this? So Mr. Clyburn said it very well when he said that look forward to speaking with the Speaker about how we can end the conversation about the flag, which is deterring the appropriations process from moving forward, to a conversation about how we can, in a bipartisan way. It's always been bipartisan. 98-0 in the Senate, I think 400 to something in the House the last time, signed by President George W. Bush, who attended Selma proudly as a president who had signed the Voting Rights Act. Thank you all very much. That's all. She's going to talk.
Beautiful.